Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. And this is a first impressions review of the Ancient Blood, the Order of the Vampire Hunters, which is a follow-up, a spiritual successor to the Order of the Vampire Hunters from Darkgate Games. Now, this game is kind of what you get if you cross, Dark Rituals from Darkgate Games and the Order of the Vampire Hunters, and you take those two games and mash them together, and you end up with a dungeon crawler game where you're a bunch of vampire hunters tackling vampires as you go through a bit of a campaign progression system, as you grow your characters, you add gear, you do all these things, level up to different degrees, and then you engage in a gameplay style, a hunter style that's very similar to what they have from Dark Ritual. So a little bit of overlap with this with different mechanics. The thing you need to know is that, one, you don't need to have played the Order of the Vampire Hunters ever at all to play this game, and two, it's basically a dungeon crawler. Dungeon crawler with a variety of heroes going through the dungeon, and then mechanics that specifically suit that game. Mechanics such as, a day-night phase in which vampires go stronger at night, and so you can do things like smashing open a window during the day to roast all the vampires in the room, but if you wait too late, if you get to the night phase of the game, this little clock over here, then not only do the vampires get stronger, but you can no longer do things like simply smashing a window and killing them. With no sunlight, there's nothing to gain, to benefit by smashing that window. Combine that with a variety of mechanics that are fairly standard in games. Some things that some things that Ancient Blood does differently. Some things that are very typical. You'll have a lot of dice rolling, a lot of action movement. Each character will have a variable number of actions they take. You'll take those actions to move around, to attack, you'll trade gear, you'll pick up items. So lots of common stuff you expect from the genre. And then a lot of things that are unique. That whole aspect of the day-night phase of killing vampires, of having different degrees of strength depending on what phase they're in. The way they handle the weight limit of the various characters. That's a system they have from Dark Rituals. The way you have the combination of a campaign progression system, a very story narrative aspect to this game, because this game, one of the things that they're doing differently from the original The Order of the Vampire Hunters is they're layering in a higher degree of story than the original game had. A lot more story points, interactions. You'll go through different phases in the game. You'll have various village phases where you wander around the village. Again, with the clock, you still have limited amounts of time, but you'll wander around the village trying to buy new items, trade items, sell items, going down different story paths of seeing somebody being attacked or harassed by somebody and then having a little choose your own mini adventure as you figure out what will happen, or whether you'll end up losing 2 wounds because you chose X, Y, and Z. Whether you'll chase someone off and wind up with a weapon that you didn't have before. They'll have that story aspect. They'll have those narrative pathways going down. And this has a full campaign progression as well, although it's worth noting that's not something I got to see or experience in this prototype. That's part of why I'm calling this a first impressions rather than a review, because I have been able to experience a limited subset of what this game has to offer. I've seen the general format, the layout, the structure of how the story will flow, but I haven't actually been able to experience that myself. So it's there, but not something I've dived into. A few other things going on. You'll have different phases. You'll have the phases of the wandering around this little lair or whatnot, trying to engage with the various vampires. You'll have different missions you're going through. The sample mission I have here involves me trying to move to the center of the lair, grab an item, and then retreat back out with bonus points, bonus money, if I kill all the vampires along the way, because I don't actually have to kill all the vampires along the way. That's a choice I have to make as far as wandering past rooms full of sleeping vampires, or engaging with them and trying to slaughter them, taking advantage of the fact that it's still day and they're weaker, but weaker does not mean weak. Weak just means not as bad as if you let them sit around till the night phase, where they will be stronger, they will activate before you, they will generally give you a much harder time if you let them survive till the night. Then there's finally the boss phase. There'll be various boss phases where you go into these dens and you take out and fight bosses. Bosses that have their own different way of tackling them. They'll have different ability cards, and every time you strike a boss, you're basically doing damage to their abilities. So the order that you choose to take down a boss, the order that you choose to activate or execute their different abilities will slowly weaken the boss, but meanwhile your health is dwindling at the same time. And so there's that constant balance of trying to figure out the right way to tackle the boss, the right way to take them down, before ultimately you and your compatriots die instead. That's a general high-level overview of Ancient Blood, the Order of the Vampire Hunters. Again, a spiritual successor. You do not have to play the original game, and if you have played the original game, one thing I do want to point out is while there is a day-night phase, there's no longer a clock where when the clock strikes 12, you lose the game. They don't have the timer they had in the original game. I mention that specifically because I know that was a big point of contention for people who like that game. There were a lot of complaints around the nature of the timer. That's no longer a factor in this game. A few other small things I didn't touch upon. Your hunters can turn into infected vampire hunters with their own little weakness that they have to manage. Maybe they have to do X, Y, and Z, or drink blood, or they have to do whatever. A bunch of other things going on in the game, but that should be a general high-level overview. Which brings us to game preferences and bias, generally just covering what I like in games, how those will affect things, and different things like that. Before we do that, though, the reason I'm calling this in first impressions is I talked about this already. In general, if I don't believe I've experienced enough of a game to be confident of where I'm up to in it, if I think that the amount of content provided was limited, then I call it a first impressions. This is a campaign-style game that I didn't get to experience the campaign. This is a game that will have multiple bosses, monsters, scenarios, encounters, of which I was given one of each type to dive into. I was given one town scenario, one path scenario, one general, dungeon crawler scenario, and then one boss fight. Each of those, while it does give me a few hours of content, it's one of each thing. I haven't been able to fully dive into this in a way that I would want to comfortably call this a review, and so I am calling it a first impressions. But with that, let's move to the game preferences, biases, things like that, starting with the fact that I tend to like dungeon crawlers. The general idea of having hunters and abilities and all that stuff wandering around a dungeon is something that I generally like, which is both a pro and a con. It's a pro because I like the genre. It's a con because I have so many games in the genre that I'm often weighing them up against each other, so it has that bar aspect to beat. And then secondly, this has a campaign. And if you watch my content, if you watch my channel, you know that campaigns are also one of those hit or miss things. I constantly find myself pulled in by the promise of what campaign games offer, but at the same time, I find it hard to actually sit down and play those campaigns. I'll sit down, I'll set the game up, and I'll get a few sessions in. Maybe I'll get 6 games in, 7, 10 games, but at a certain point, I put it back down and I don't pick it up because the next time there's that hurdle of figuring out where I left off. So I like the promise of campaigns, but I tend to be slightly critical of them just because I don't end up playing them, unfortunately. Moving from there into art and components. Art and components. The art in general, I really like. It does lean a little dark, but not in a way that has impeded my ability to dive into this. And this is the same artist as The Order of the Vampire Hunters, as Dark Rituals. I really enjoy both the art of those games. I think it's consistent. I believe it's the same designer. I believe the designer is also the artist, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But overall, I really like the art. The characters stick out nicely. The boards look great. I can see some people being concerned about being too dark, but I haven't found it to be too dark in a way that interacts or gets in the way of the actual gameplay. Components, the components look fine overall. The miniatures look amazing. The miniatures look great. I do have some small quibbles around the fact that this miniature here and this miniature here, despite having that same hunching profile, are actually different miniatures. So there is a little bit of potential concern with some of the sculpt design. One of those things that's interesting is generally when you have standing up miniatures, there's a degree of looking closer. But when you have something more unique like this hunched over sculpt, there's almost a tendency to just look at 2 of them and just assume that they're the same when they're actually not. It's something that I started putting miniatures on the board incorrectly as I was playing, before I realized at one point, wait a second, that's not the right miniature. So small little nitpick there, but overall the miniatures look great. That's going to be par for the course for Darkgate games. Most of their games, most of the miniatures have looked great. I think their worst game miniature quality-wise is actually the original The Order of the Vampire Hunters. They weren't bad, they just weren't as good as their follow-up games, and this is definitely one of their better ones as far as the miniature quality, sculpting, detail, all of that. Granted, these are resins as opposed to, final production PVC, but their games generally have looked great as far as that. Theme and narrative. Theme is great. There's a host of vampire games out there. There's a lot of vampire games out there in the board game space. I haven't played most of them, despite there being an abundance of them. I've played Nightfall. I don't know if I can remember any other vampire-based games, vampire-themed games I've played. I like the theme. It's not necessarily unique or standing out, but the general theme of dealing with vampires, vampire hunters, all of that, it works well, and I like the way, more specifically, how they integrate it with the mechanics. Now, you're not going to see a lot of integration, but the general idea of the night and day phase is a lot of fun. That idea of smashing down a window to let light into the room, well, we'll talk about that a lot more during my highlights, but it's definitely one of the fun moments of the game, so I like the theme overall. Narrative-wise, what I've seen so far has worked. And what I mean by that is I've seen those little miniature choose-your-own-adventure style interactions you can have. And they all work well. You see someone being beaten by a group of thugs. You go ahead and tackle them. The thugs say, no, he stole our money. What do you do next? Do you harass the thugs or do you turn to the old man? There's a little chain of different things that will lead down different story paths, usually involving some sort of minor outcome. Minor outcomes, like I touched upon already, you might lose some health, you might find some food, you might get a gear that will help you as the game progresses, so those little story paths have been enjoyable so far. The higher level campaign storyline, I've gotten a little bit of a taste of what the thing will look like, and it seems fine, but I haven't really been able to actually dive down into myself, and so reading a paragraph of text with no follow-up gameplay interaction takes away from my personal immersion there, so again, just a lack of being able to fully experience that campaign aspect. As far as ease of play, this covers a range of things that will potentially stop you from getting the game to the table or make it easier to get the game to the table. And starting off, Very much a note that this is a prototype. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. I think I did. This is very much a prototype. This is on Kickstarter. There'll be a link in the description down below. But as far as the prototype aspect, the rulebook is on the longer side. But in general, I would say Darkgate games, their games generally do have longer rulebooks, but a lot of art and text, making it a lot to take in, but not hard to take in, if that makes sense. More importantly, they actually tend to have, I don't know if they'll have one for this, but they tend to have videos that do a great job introducing people to the how to play of their games. I've watched their videos for Dark Rituals, for the Order of the Vampire Hunters, and that's how I've learned to play those games. I haven't even played those games, for context. I know how to play both of them because I've watched the rulebook, I've watched the videos and dived into the rulebook of Dark Rituals as well, but I know how to play both those games from those. And so if they continue that, that'd be great over here. It would really do a lot to ease the jumping in, because like I said already, it's not a lot, it's not complicated. Sorry, it's not complicated. It is a lot as far as the rulebook and whatnot. This is a game where, specifically because it's cooperative, I feel I can get you up and running in 10 minutes and just some high-level notes, details. Now let's just go ahead and start off. But if you're learning it, there's a lot more to take in over there. Past that, as far as ease of play, table space is not particularly large. In fact, everything you're seeing here really is all I need to set up for a decent game. A little few things off the side, not a lot. So table space, table size is not a lot. But as far as the campaign aspect, that's something worth addressing. It is a campaign game that in general takes away from the ease of play, from the ability to get something tabled, and so factor that into your buying decisions and all that. Player count. This is a 1 to 4 player game that I have only played this one solo. Now what I will say is this genre of game in general, dungeon crawlers in general, and specifically with the 4 characters going on here, this is a game where I can easily see myself playing it with 2 and enjoying it with 2. You'll have that tactical discussion back and forth, and there's a lot of tactical discussion back and forth. As far as playing it at 3 and 4, I'd be reluctant to do so. I generally find dungeon crawlers, for me at least, get less rewarding the more I'm splitting that playtime amongst multiple players, and so it just ends up being harder to actually do a lot myself. Perhaps it works for you. I would say that's more of a genre question than specifically to Ancient Blood itself. Which brings us to highlights, nitpicks, and meaningful critiques. The things I liked, the things I'm going to complain about, and the things that actually take away from my enjoyment of the game. Highlights really come down to the building up your gear, your character, developing your skills, finding weapons, stuff like that, and then much more importantly, the decision space around this game. This is a dungeon crawler that has an AI that's fairly simple, but one that's easy to manage. You're going to go ahead and take your action. When you're done, all enemies take their action. So all enemies will perhaps move a space closer to you and then move spaces closer to the other characters, and then perhaps attack in between. It's a fairly simple to follow AI. But it's an AI that provides a lot of decision making around it. Combined with the fact that you have these aspects of the first half of the game, when you walk into a room, most of the vampires you see, and there's not always vampires, but when they are vampires, they'll be sleeping vampires. And so you have this decision of, do you try to kill a vampire? Because when you try to kill a vampire, if you get it in one blow, if you manage to take it out right away and you manage to decrease its health to 0, well then you actually kill it and no one else wakes up. But if you fail, other things wake up. And you don't want other things waking up in this game, because suddenly that room becomes a lot harder. And so you have this constant decision of, do you walk past the vampires? Will they cause a challenge for you later? Will they pose a threat later? Or maybe you don't need to. Maybe you can get out because this is scenario driven. There's reasons and things you're trying to do in this game. And so as you explore, you're putting down various creatures on the board. Some will be awake, but most will be asleep, at least until you get to the night phase. And that leaves a lot of decision space around what you do. Combine that with the various windows, and you have even more decision space, because now it's more than a question. Maybe you want to attack the vampire to wake it up because you don't even care if you kill it, because you're actually hoping that when you're done doing that, it will walk into your room, and then you'll follow that with walking over to a window, breaking the window, and letting light flood into the room. My favorite moment of this game so far, hands down, was when I managed to get 6 vampires together in one room and have another one of my hunters break the window, and then poof, everything went boom and died, and that was a lot of fun. Now, I took hits along the way. In fact, one of my vampires, sadly there were sacrifices, one of my hunters was surrounded by those 6 because he was acting as bait, and he died. He died and became, turned and whatnot, so that was not great, but then again, I killed them all and managed to finish the mission and win and all that, so again, very satisfying. There's a lot of trade-off around the threat going on. You can lure 6 vampires into a room, but you'll probably end up having someone die, but maybe it's worth the trade-off. There's a lot of decision space in this game. Additionally, we haven't even talked about the fact that there's decision space around the attacking in this game. You see, the attacking has a system where you're going to be taking into account the strength of the attack and the speed of the attack. And that's true for defense as well. The defense has, armor and speed. And so speed basically negates speed. The idea being that a heavy attack will do more damage, but is easier to evade. So against faster enemies, you want fast attacks. Against slow enemies, you want heavy attacks. There's a different balance of what's going on in the game. And that adds more decision space. Moving into a space, you're shooting at range, whether you use up an ammo on one of your advanced weapons. There are a lot of decisions to be made in Ancient Blood, in the Order of the Vampire Hunters, as you go through these dungeons, as you try to explore. That decision space is easily the highlight of what I like about this game. Moving on to nitpicks. Nitpicks have a few small things. First of all there's this concept of combined attacks. There are these combined attacks which are fun. They add an extra way that you can actually get in hits, because it's hard to get in hits. Remember I said those 6 vampires are tough? I meant it. Getting in hits against some of these vampires can be really hard, especially if you don't have the right hunter at the right time and place. Because if you're trying to get in a hit against a vampire that has 2 strong defense and 3 speed, you're going to have to struggle to get it done. Which is where these combined attacks come into play. These ideas of, you can set up a scenario, you can have one hunter in the next room shooting a ranged attack, and another hunter in the room with the vampire who's distracting that hunter. They have a cost paid in vials of blood that you get when you kill other vampires. But that cost will result in having an easier time because you're distracting the vampire, you're working against it. You're dodging around it and trying to distract it while somebody else shoots a crossbow into the room and gets a hit on the vampire. Now these combined attacks are great. I like them. They add a lot to the game. But for myself, I kind of want to see these as unlocks that your character can unlock and develop. This is why this is a nitpick and not like a meaningful critique or anything. I want to see these as character unlocks. I want Otto over here to learn a skill as he progresses through the campaign. I want Otto to get, a double melee attack and be able to learn how to do that. I want it to be something unique to him that he can do, that I can slot alongside his character and he can take that specific action. It would do 2 things. It would ease the degree of what you have to know going in, because you don't have to memorize all the variety. I only have 4 in the prototype, but there's a whole bunch more of these that you'll have. I don't have to learn all the combined attacks. I only have to learn them as I go through the game. That would be that would add a degree of less burden of what you're taking on as you start, but then also it gives me a sense of character progression, of earning things, of getting that. And so I kind of wish those were, something you unlocked as opposed to something you just had access to. Past that, 2 other small nitpicks. First of all, not a fan of the weight system. They generally have, and this is something they have from Dark Rituals as well, I believe, but characters have a weight system. You can't carry 5 items, you can carry 15 weight, or Otto can carry 19 weight. And all the items have a little weight tag on them of what they weigh. From a mechanical standpoint, it works well, and if this were a video game, it would work great. The problem is I find myself constantly re-adding up the weight of what I have in my inventory when I make these decisions. So it's not really fun for me to be like, oh, I'm in the village, and now I have 17 weight, okay, I'm still good. Oh wait, no, and this character has 14 weight. Like, you're adding it all up. You have to go through each of these items that weighs between 1 and 3 a piece, and you slowly add up to these larger numbers. It's fine, it's not hard math, but it's a frequent and constant interruption that is, to me, unnecessary. I shouldn't say not necessary. To me, it does more to take away from the experience than it does to add. And then lastly, as far as nitpicks, there's this extra action system that I do like the extra action system. This idea of vials of blood can be spent to both trigger combined attacks, as well as to earn extra actions. You want to get an extra roll on something, so maybe you'll get a re-roll on your attack if you pay a vial of blood first, which works well. What I don't love is they have this aspect where you're trying to line up these circles over here, and you can only do what works when these circles and symbols line up. I understand that it's another minigame, another decision space. Again, like the weight, while I appreciate the decision space it adds to the game, it added more to the finickiness of the experience than it did to the actual decision space or interestingness of the decision it's adding. As far as meaningful critiques, I have one and only one, and that's head-to-head combat. I really like the general sense of dungeon crawling in this game. I like the decision space around all these things, of when to sneak past, of how to attack with which hunter to which hunter, of how to navigate, manage the rooms, manage the windows, all that stuff. There's a lot going on here. But then some scenarios pit you up against enemies in much more head-to-head combat. A lot less nuance about the environment around you, and a lot more just characters going head-to-head in the game. And I didn't appreciate that nearly as much. In fact, I'd say I found it to be a bit of a grind. Because of the nature of the combat system, where you're rolling dice back and forth, you're rolling dice to try to take an attack, and then the character's rolling defense, and then you're going back and forth, and very frequently, you don't actually get to do a lot of damage against enemies. The way the evading works and the way the armor works, more often than not, you're pinging enemies one at a time, and they're pinging you one at a time. It's a war of attrition as you slowly wind people down. Now, in the greater scheme of the dungeon, that works really well. That gives me a lot of decision space around what's happening. in a direct head-to-head, single tile interaction where there's not a lot of room to navigate and move around, and it mostly comes down to rolling dice, it just becomes a slower grind. Not so much an interaction, so much as just a lot of rolling dice until eventually one side wins. Still strategy. To be very clear, the combined attacks, the minor amounts of movement, there's still strategy and decision. But the balance of strategy and decision versus just rolling dice and grinding, that's a lot worse. So for me, really appreciate the dungeon aspect, but those few times where you're being placed head to head, I don't appreciate that nearly as much. Which brings me to final thoughts on Ancient Blood: Order of the Vampire Hunters. This is my first experience with a Dark Gate Games game. Basically, I have not had Order of the Vampire Hunters. I do have Dark Rituals, haven't played it. I know how to play both those games because, well, I watched the videos for Order of the Vampire Hunters and have prepped to play, but have not successfully played Dark Rituals. But overall, this is my first experience into one of their games, and it's one that I really enjoyed with that primary combat around that direct head-to-head mechanism. The other things in Nitpicks, those I don't really care one way or the other. The small little complaints. The head-to-head combat, for me, I didn't appreciate at all, and it's the kind of thing I'd probably just aggressively pursue past, or house rule past if I was going through the game, depending on how frequent they are. I'm hoping that this experience has a lot more dungeon crawling, and or they do something to mix up the direct head-to-head combat as far as the game. There's a lot of decisions to be made here, and I mean, again, I can't say it enough. The moment where I lured 6 vampires into a room, sacrificing hits and taking pot shots along the way in order to do so, but eventually resulting in me smashing that window and then blowing up into vampire dust, was tremendously satisfying. And that was not the only satisfying moment I have. As you wander around the dungeon, as you explore cars, as you turn things over, there are a lot of fun moments in this game, a lot of decisions based on a lot of things to do. I am curious how the final game ends up as far as the campaign aspect. I'm curious whether there's enough to pull me in because, like I said at the beginning of this video, I am harder on campaigns than other games because I have to have the desire to pull them out time and time again. Lots of things about Ancient Blood really worked for me. Some aspects not as much, and I want to see how they play out. But overall, this is a solid one from Dark Gate Games. Dark Gate Games, that's the name of the company, yes. In any case, until next time, I am Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you found this video helpful. Like I said already, there is a link to the Kickstarter in the description below. And as always, have a good one.